on the topic of demons or the spiritual world, and from everywhere from the spiritual warfare to they don't exist. We have all kinds of stuff like that. So what I wanted to do was look at some of the things that inspired the Desert Fathers as it pertained to the particular conversation that we're having, and then look at Scripture and spend a few minutes diving into that. And if you guys have any questions about it, comments, whatever, please feel free to share. Sarah had asked the question. Maybe, Sarah, you could post your question. Again, how do you distinguish between mental and what is demonization? Which is a great place to start with that. How do you distinguish between what's mental and what is demonization? And the dilemma, before we even answer that question, though, the dilemma with a question like that is it assumes all kinds of things about the nature of reality and the nature of what life is like. And then it builds the question based off of the assumptions. And I think what you find in Scripture, and this is why it's such a big topic that you have to unpeel how we think about the topic before you can answer anything related to the topic. What you find when you look at Scripture is that the physical nature of reality is not separate and distinct over against the spiritual nature of reality. A great way of thinking through that is David's language in Psalm 139. And he's speaking of the presence of God. Where can I go from you, O God? I could go to the highest of heavens and you would be there. I can go to the depths of Sheol and you would be there. You are always there. David doesn't see the spiritual order of existence as inherently separate and distinct from the physical order of existence. And he doesn't see God as someone or a being separate and distinct in a place that is inaccessible. And so primarily when you look at Scripture, you find Scripture laced with references to an embodied God within creation. And that's one of the great realities of the issue of the temple. When we see our theology through the lens of the Old Testament and the existence of the temple existed to be the embodied presence of God in His creation. He says in Ezekiel, referring to Ezekiel 40 to 48, which talks specifically about the temple, that the temple is the place where God will rule and reign all of His creation through. And even the ultimate end that we see in Revelation 21 and 22 is that God is inherently embodied within His creation in the temple. He says it no longer needs a temple because God is the temple in the midst of creation. And there's a new heaven and a new earth. So it doesn't mean that we go into this disembodied place like our popular theology tends to communicate, harps and angels and clouds and fluffy, nice things, that kind of stuff. That's just really not the narrative of Scripture. So first we have to investigate the nature of reality before we say, how do we distinguish between what's simply mental and what's demonization? Because I think when you look at Scripture that you really can't make the distinction between the two. And we live in a day and an age where we make the distinction between the two. We live in inherently a world that is there's a dichotomy in the world, or a duality in the world. We have spirit and matter. We are very influenced by Platonic philosophy in the Western mindset. So yeah, and so Sarah, I guess what would just be natural and maybe needed to be healed through medicine because of chemical imbalances, because of the fall of creation, Jesus, spiritual rhythms, and what is a system of demonic? It's the simple answer to that, and the overarching answer to that is you can't separate what is a physical struggle. Here's the thing. Okay, let's dial it back just a second. When you're in a worship service and you are distinctly impacted by the presence of God, where is that? How would you express the perception of the presence of God. Some people, they would say they get goosebumps. Some people, they feel a warmth within their chest. Some people, there's this overwhelming sense of peace that comes over them. Some people, exuberant joy and ecstatic dancing and praise. All kinds of different ways that we would talk about the presence of God coming upon us, and every single one of them has a physical a physical perception to them. And so much so that sometimes when we don't feel anything, we feel completely on the outside, because we go, all these other people seem like they're having some kind of experience, and I'm not. What's wrong with me? I've had that conversation with a number of different people. And throughout Christian history, we see that, and we see that in Scripture too. David is another great example. In the language of David, is that while I meditated, my heart was hot within me. So he's talking about a distinct physical phenomenon that's happening in prayer. So the separating the reality of demonic influence, the struggle against that, from the physical reality, is you just can't do it. We try and do it. We try and make it either or, but it's not an either or. And it's the same way. Like, here's another question you can ask yourself to kind of drive the point home: is anybody that's experienced heartbreak, that deep sense of loss or betrayal or anything like that, the pain of that, you have emotional repercussions to those kind of things, right? Someone has betrayed you, maybe you've the loss of a boyfriend or girlfriend, or the dissolution of a marriage, that kind of stuff, that everybody experiences what we would call negative emotions: depression, anxiety, fear, sadness, grief, those types of things. For every emotion that you feel, there is your body feels it. You can't separate it from your body. You can't say, my body doesn't feel this, my body does feel this. Your grief is not experienced outside of a physical embodiment of grief. It impacts your body and how you live. It impacts how you feel. It impacts the chemicals in your brain. The chemicals in our brain are responsible in part for how we feel. So a chemical imbalance, saying, is it just a chemical imbalance as a result of the fall, or is it demonization? You can't say it's one or the other, because they're to the perception of the spiritual world, to the perception of spiritual realities, there is always a physical response. And so it's not either or. Great language is Job. I think it's in Job 7, or maybe it's Job 14. Job talks about how a spirit passed before his face, and that essentially the hair on his body stood up. If you read into the Hebrew language, he had a physical response to the presence of some kind of spirit. And so it's not either or. It's not, well, I'm just demonized and so I need deliverance, or it's not demonization, so I need healing. It's a both and. And this is the point that the Desert Fathers make. And this is what I think a great example that we see in the life of Jesus, when Jesus is in the wilderness, that his struggle with the devil in the wilderness is a very much an embodied struggle. The devil uses the issue of hunger, of course, in the first temptation. He uses the issue of pride in the pride and arrogance in the third temptation, which again we have physical responses to those things. We feel certain ways about ourselves when we have pride. You can't separate the emotion of feeling from the chemicals and that drive those from the disembodied self or the soul. And then when throw yourself down from the top of this temple, and the angels of God will. So what you believe about yourself, what you believe to be true about the nature of reality and who you are, all of these things are not distinctly, an external thing. They are distinctly the internal struggle against the heart, and with the heart. And obviously Jesus overcomes the struggle, but the Desert Fathers, and the early church fathers for that matter, saw the struggle not so much as disembodied demonic forces that were coming to them, but the struggle against spiritual forces was an inherently spiritual struggle. And it was an inherently physical struggle as well. And so you got fasting wasn't just to lose weight. Fasting was going to impact the way that you were formed on an internal level and the way your heart responded, because what you did physically impacted you spiritually. They're one and the same. They're not separate. So the issue of, is it a chemical imbalance or is it a demonic influence, is both and. It's not either or. There's always a spiritual influence. I was a few minutes late on starting the live stream because a friend of mine called me, very good friend of mine, and so I didn't want to miss the call. And we were talking about the moment that Samuel was um, uh, when Samuel was told by, or sorry, when Saul was told by Samuel in the Old Testament, Saul's told by Samuel to go and wait 7 days, and Samuel's going to come to Saul. And when Samuel shows up, he shows up late, and Saul has sacrificed. He's taken a position he's not supposed to. This is the moment of trial, and Saul, this is the moment where Samuel prophesies to Saul that the kingdom has been taken from Saul. And I mean, there's a lot of things that lead up into it, but Saul is waiting for 7 days for Samuel to show up. Samuel's told him he's going to show up in 7 days, and Samuel doesn't show up, and so Saul takes Samuel's position as priest and offers the sacrifices. He does it when he's not supposed to. And so I was just saying to my friend, if we peeled back the layers and could see transparently what was happening on every layer of creation, every layer of the reality of that moment, you would probably see dark spiritual forces whispering to Saul, "Hey, you should do it yourself. You should do it yourself. You should do it yourself." And because the inherent struggle is not, I need to kick a demon out. The inherent struggle is that my heart needs to resist the types of temptations that would come. And so it's not one or the other. It's both and. There's always a physical presence. There's always an embodiment to what we struggle with. And so anxiety, yes, we can clinically diagnose anxiety, and we can look at the chemical imbalances of what drives anxiety and all of that. And we can look at the history of pain and trauma that can create anxiety later in life. We're going to be talking about that this weekend. But we have to think through and be realistic with the fact that when we're struggling with anxiety, we are also struggling on a spiritual level. See, and here's the thing, and we're going to end pretty soon, only because there's other things to do as well. I could probably talk forever about this. My struggle with anxiety is not so much a struggle against anxious thoughts. And that's the first place where we get off base when we say, how do we deal with anxiety? It's not a struggle against anxious thoughts, because I'll lose that struggle every single time. I do not have the power within myself to change my thought life. And if I do, it's a very difficult thing to do. And it takes a long time and a lot of effort to do, especially when we're dealing with anxiety, because anxiety comes, it's not like you plan for anxiety. It comes at you. It comes out of nowhere. And so my struggle is not to not be anxious. That's not my struggle. It's not against the thoughts. My struggle is not to not be anxious. Because I don't recognize in my current paradigm and my current worldview that I could actually, my struggle with anxiety could predominantly be, or in part be, a struggle against a spiritual reality attempting to influence me. My response is not spiritual. My response is, in my own effort, I am going to try and resist this thing. And then because some of our paradigms for spiritual formation and how I grow and how I become like Jesus are based upon my ability to make the right choices in my will. And so if I strengthen my will, I thus become more spiritually mature. And that's a whole other topic that we can unpack at a later time. The impetus for spiritual change is not having a stronger will. And the impetus for dealing with anxiety is not trying to change my chemical imbalance. that is a temporary reprieve from a deeper problem. And so if we fail to address what the nature of reality actually is, that there is a spiritual force, that there is something that I need to respond to, that it's not just something that is a struggle with my particular thoughts, that it's not just a physical thing, then I'm going to fail to have a holistic response to the entire problem. And so I'm not, by the way, I'm not in saying that, I'm not saying that there's not a place um, for medication for anxiety or for depression. I think there absolutely is. I have a problem with it being the solution. Take this and you will be okay. Because it fails to address holistically the person, why the anxiety is there, why the depression is there, and it fails to connect the person in a meaningful way to the presence of Jesus, who is the one who fights for us. And so that's where spiritual formation comes in. That's where learning to live a life of rhythm, of receiving from the Father and becoming like Him, a life of finding Jesus in the midst of those difficulties. He is the one that deals with anxiety. I've had many times where there's a bill that's due, there's life crises that have happened, whatever it happens to be. And I could lay in bed all night long. I've done it all night long, just going, how is this going to work? What are we going to do? Oh my gosh. Oh no. What's going to happen? I understand that struggle. And simply put that, and this is where the spiritual world comes into play, is that my broken thought process is aided by the demonic thought process of, you're right, it's never going to be okay. It's the whispering voice of the devil going, it's not going to be okay. Everything's going to fall apart. Nothing's going to be okay. You're never going to be taken care of, and it spirals. I used to be really good at spiraling. And so if I don't recognize that it's not just my anxiety, it's also a spiritual reality, I'm not going to respond properly. And the proper response, to simplify it, is, what is the perspective of the Father, and how is my heart connected with Him, and how in my life. See, the problem is I can't deal with anxiety in the moment of anxiety. I plan in my life to be connected with the heart of the Father, and when anxious moments happen, I'm actually prepared to respond. Exactly, Sarah. Soul care is the best care, the deeper life with Jesus. That is, and that doesn't mean that anxiety is going to be gone. It means you have the resources to respond in the moment of trial. The Desert Fathers, and I love this ethos about them. Many times, many of them would say, without temptation, no one can be saved. One of them, I think it's either Abba Pombo or Abba Poman, says, life is a struggle until you die. And they looked at that struggle. That's why they looked at Jesus as the preeminent example. Jesus went into the desert, was led into the desert by the Spirit, struggled, and came out in the power of the Spirit. And so they see that and they go, the struggle is worth it because something happens in the struggle. So they would never want to remove the struggle with temptation from, it's like, okay, now I have no longer, do I have any struggle? Actually, there's a couple of times where you get a disciple going to a Desert Father saying, hey, I've conquered sin. I no longer struggle with it. And they say, well, something's right around the corner. You better be careful, because that means that you're deceived. And so our struggle, again, when we re-understand our struggle is not with flesh and blood, but with powers and principalities, we think our struggle is, when we say that, we think it's with the demon that's way up in the heavens that's attempting to influence our whole culture. That may be a reality, but there's a power, one of those things that we struggle against, that Paul says is a power. So what you're struggling against is not just flesh and blood, but a power trying to influence you on a daily basis. And so my struggle is there. My struggle with flesh and blood is to submit my flesh and blood. Like Paul says, I beat up my body daily. I buffet my body daily. So there's a spiritual reality to all physical reality. And so we can't separate those two. We have to recognize that they're one and the same, at the very least intertwined. And that is a hard thing for most of our Western brains to wrap around, because we've been so taught within our culture to look at life through a dualistic lens, as opposed to an embodied lens, that God is here in creation and He loves creation and He loves what He has created. And He longs to dwell in His creation through His people. If we don't see that, we're going to make all kinds of wrong assumptions about what the nature of the spiritual life is all about.